Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. And this is the first one of a brand new series called Thrive Tuesdays, where we talk about various topics that are important to you. So today's is about sovereign authenticity, and this is reclaiming your voice, your presence, and your power. If we haven't met, I am Tara Palazzolo. I'm an intuitive mentor, emotional strategist, and sovereign guide. Here's a little brief overview of what I do, but in short, I worked in corporate for a while. I was an analytical chemist at pharma for 16 years, and then I worked in information security for over 10. And so what I do with True Path is I help clients understand of how they can live their best life, and I do a lot with pattern recognition as well as helping people transform to become their authentic sovereign self. So the question that I'd like to have you answer is, which of these characters is your default when you slip up into performing or people pleasing? The first one is a hero. This is the person who takes on everything. They're the first person to raise their hand and say, I'll do it. The navigator is, I call the emotional survey. They are looking at the room to figure out how to avoid conflict. I also call this my risk assessor. Copycat always pretends to be fine, or they mimic whatever is in the room. You have the mime. These are somebody who just kind of tries to be the wallflower or blend into the background. The martyr knight has to handle everything alone. No task is too big and they don't need any help. Lastly is the candidate. And this is the person that is going to make you feel like everything's all okay and they will adapt to any single situation. So these are all forms of what blocks your authenticity, which I call inner abandonment. So when one of these default modes takes over, it actually weakens your sovereignty and your authenticity. And these patterns can show up through former conditioning, and it doesn't have to be a trauma response. That's a big T that we call, or a little t. It has to do a lot with everything from epigenetics and genetics, environmental, based on what societal or culture norms are. And they show up through patterns like when you automatically say yes, even though you're tired, or you downplay your needs. And some examples of this could be when somebody asks you to bake cookies tomorrow morning, and you know that you won't get off work until 11 p.m., and you're already exhausted from working a ton of overtime that week, you might automatically default and say yes because you feel like everybody depends on you. You also might have had pizza last night for dinner, and then you had pizza at a work luncheon today, and then your kids are screaming for pizza. And that is really the last thing that you want to have. And so you immediately just give in and say yes because that's easier. You can minimize your voice or presence. This could look like just agreeing with everybody else that's in the room. You can also choose harmony over honesty, and that would look like, perhaps in a meeting, everybody wants to go to 4-day work weeks. And that means working 10 to 12-hour days, but that actually coincides and with what their schedule looks like, not necessarily that works best for you and your family, but you just say yes because you're the underdog. And then managing other people's emotions when you can't even manage your own. And so, for example, you might be having the worst day ever and really could just want to talk to a trusted friend, but instead you end up being the emotional tampon, is what I call it, for somebody else who's having a meltdown, which just adds to your burden. So what is authenticity? And that is the ability to stay connected to yourself. And these are your values, your integrity, your what you deem important, rather than slipping back into these survival modes of the inner abandonment. And it shows up as an inner truth that is reflected in your outer expression. There is an alignment between what you value in your actions, and then you have the courage to stop performing only to be accepted. And then the biggest thing is you're choosing to be clear about what you want instead of defaulting to what other people want. And so authenticity begins when self-abandonment ends. What authenticity is not. A lot of times in today's modern society, people walk around screaming, saying, I'm just being authentic, or I have to say this because otherwise I'm not being my authentic self. And a lot of times this stems from dysregulation, fear, or unprocessed emotion, and not necessarily truth. And it's often speaking without awareness for others. It's oversharing. And it also is a lot of times brutal honesty. And I call this truth without compassion. And then it's also a boundaryless vulnerability. And lastly, it's hurting others people to dominate mentally, physically, or sexually. So, for example, if you happen to react from a dysregulated state where you blow your top whenever you get angry and you're like, well, I have frustration issues. And that becomes an excuse to hurt other people when you are angry. And it does not give you a permission slip to be an asshole. So, why does authenticity feel hard, right? If we want to do what we want to do, then why is it so hard to navigate this? Because a lot of times um, we've been conditioned to put our needs secondary. Some of this is due to society, some of it is based on where we're at in our family. And it becomes very difficult to be honest when it once created conflict. Needs are often dismissed, minimized, or labeled as too much. Peace is prioritized over speaking the truth. And so a lot of this has to do with how others are affected by our decisions. And I'll give you an example. So you might be raised in a particular culture that puts a lot of emphasis on college education, becoming a doctor or a lawyer, or maybe an accomplished musician. And when you're put that type of pressure to have these more expertise, how would it feel for somebody to express that, no, I don't want to go to college. I actually don't know what I want to do right now? Or how hard would it be for somebody that after a long line in their family that entered in the military, they say, I really don't want to be in the armed services. It's very hard. It's almost like peer pressure. And it's hard for us to be different because once upon a time, to stay safe meant survival. And the way that our brain has evolved biochemically is that we relied on other people. The lone hunter usually didn't survive. They stayed with the pack. They hunted together. They protected each other. And so some of it is a long history of evolution, but society also makes it really hard as well. And so these subconscious survival tactics actually rule our nervous system. So I do say that there's a cost of inauthenticity. And it can be like not taking the job that you really want or doing the career that you feel like you want to do rather than is required to do. But I say that it's higher than that. It really, you pay for it with pieces of yourself. It usually erodes your joy over time, and also your voice and your boundaries and your confidence. And sometimes it even like removes you to be able to understand what you actually want. And an example of this is maybe your workplace wants you to come into work an hour early every day for overtime. And with that, it means that you have to shift things around with your sitter, and it doesn't work with your kid's school schedule. But you just say, okay, I'll do this. It's only one day a week. And then one day a week turns into 2 days a week. The cost of authenticity is the eroding over time, and it doesn't happen all at once. So, an important fact about authenticity is that your inner world is going to be affected and you're going to be conflicted long before the external world ever notices. Everybody is usually very focused on themselves. And so, if you're in agony over a decision or constantly ruminating or regretful about a decision that you made, it's going to tend to fester internally before anybody notices. But once you shift into authenticity, it becomes abundantly apparent. Maybe not all at once in a big grandeur of emotions, but the people that are affected will notice. And this might be the people that support you and say, hey, it's about time you finally said that. But it could also be the ones that are uncomfortable. Like, what do you mean you don't want to go to school for that? And even people that have benefited from you self abandoning you. And so, an example of that is that you decide that you don't want to go into the military. Your friends are all excited because you're an amazing artist, but you were in a relationship that they were really hoping that you would go in the military because that gave them more support rather than conception that all artists are starving. And that's a stigma you have to break. But maybe your partner's like, well, at least the military will pay for college, etc. So authenticity does not create problems, but what it will do is it'll put a microscope and reveal the different cracks that are in your relationships. Well, authenticity, when you embrace it creates clarity and a confidence and a much more inner peace and emotional regulation. It allows for aligned decision making and relationships and sustainable self leadership. And it gives you what you want without requiring to fight for it. It begins to become natural. So, where authenticity and sovereignty meets, if authenticity is your inner truth, sovereignty is your ability to lead from that. And so your inner experience and your outer experience behavior become in alignment. And you're not seeking approval, so you're allowed to speak your truth. And then any choices that you make reflect this authentic identity rather than from a preconditioned role. And your voice and your values and your boundaries really remain consistent, and it doesn't really change no matter the situation, the environment, or the people around you, because it's tied to your identity rather than an external experience. And then, like I had mentioned before, the self connection to self stays intact even under pressure. And what this means is that despite external threats to maybe your safety or your financial circumstances, you really feel aligned and okay with that decision. So, sovereignty is the self leadership rooted in truth, and it's the ability to remain aligned without abandoning a core value. And like the previous slide had, I want to give an example of something that I had experienced in my career. So, I'm definitely consider myself very sovereign in my career. I tend to not waver in my values. And when I was working as a pharmaceutical chemist, I had discovered that there was some data that was misrepresented. It was not tested in accordance to policy and procedure. And I was asked to review the data and sign off on it. And when I discovered this challenge, I brought it to the appropriate level of supervision, and they told me that I needed to sign off on it. And I knew that it had been tested wrong and that it was a problem with the integrity of the data. And so at that point, I knew that my value as an employee, I also knew my ability to make money and pay my bills, even if I left this job, would be okay. I used to waitress and I would go back to waitressing. It did not matter to me, but I was not signing off on that data. So when I was told that I had to sign off the data, I promptly gave my 2 weeks notice and I didn't throw a fit. I didn't demand that they do it. I didn't threaten retaliation. I just simply resigned that I was not going to do that and I would accept the consequences. So when we use authenticity to speak our needs, and then sovereignty has built a foundation that makes that a line in the sand, it's easier to hold that. And you're not coming from a place of fear. So once we get sovereignty, why is it lost? It slips up when survival takes over. Just like authenticity and sovereignty is built over time, it can erode over time. And so you might move into a new situation in your career that your circumstances change, or it might trigger an old dynamic. I use this example all the time. You might be holding your boundaries in career and you might say, I am not going to work overtime. I'm not making cookies for the PTA meeting. I'm not doing these various things. I'm going to bed at 10 o'clock at night. I'm not going to take on tasks when I feel tired, and I am my own person. And then suddenly, I'm just going to use an example, your mom calls. And it's the week of Thanksgiving this week, so I'll use this as an example. And she says, honey, I know that you've been doing a lot this past week, but I need you to bring some special dish that takes you 4 hours to make. And can you be here by 11? Because I need you to help prep when you're not supposed to get together until 3 in the afternoon. So not only has she asked you to make something that's very difficult after a week of working, she's asking you to come over early so you can't even do it that morning. And you just slip up and say yes. You don't want the argument. So you're holding sovereignty in every area of your life, but there might be a situation that triggers. Healing and growth and learning new values is not linear. We just don't automatically go back. And so what happens is I always explain it to people that you're kind of always pressing against the outside of your boundaries and your aura and keeping them intact. And sometimes it's only coming from the one side. Maybe it's only coming back from pushback from work. Maybe it's only coming from pushback from your kids or your partner or your family. These are the moments when we're tired, we're exhausted, we're overwhelmed, we haven't been sleeping well, we've been sick, we're stressed. And these different areas in our lives are when little by little decisions start to roll backwards and we do go back to some default patterns. And maybe they weren't the ones when we initially put together these characters that served their mechanisms in their default mode. Maybe these are new. Maybe you used to be the hero, but now you're the mime. And these are like how this can change over time. So we're constantly scanning our inner landscape and seeing where we're losing authenticity. So when sovereign is present, it really feels like a very calm center that doesn't shift or change. You don't feel like you're on a boat where sometimes it's calm and sometimes it's rocky. You always feel like you have a clear inner direction. You might not know exactly what you want. Say you're trying to decide what you're going to take in college or what you're going to do for a career, but what is present is what you don't want. So for example, just because you don't know that you don't want to go to college doesn't mean that you have to take every crappy career that is thrown to you just to have a job. And so you might say, well, I really know that I want to work in law enforcement and I don't want to go to school, for example. Do you want to go to a police academy? Do you want to do something in the military with like an MP or something like that? It's the figuring it out that makes it sovereign. And these boundaries hold without apology, and your energy really stays regulated instead of reactive. People can experience their feelings without it affecting you. So sovereignty ultimately creates these conditions that kind of feel like home, and it's an emotional containment and it's sustainable power and energetic integrity. It allows you to have self-governance and you are discerning in your decisions. And most importantly is you get this nervous system stability where you just feel like you are making decisions instead of reacting. So when we do the sovereign shift, it clicks into place when external power turns to internal authority. So external power is always borrowed. It's like having a loan from the bank with a very high interest rate. It's tied to titles and productivity, how others respond, maybe to how much money you make. And it really feels like the rug can slip out from underneath you at any given point, and it keeps you in a fear state. It's unstable and it's reactive, and it's 1000% easily disrupted by with the easiest thing that can happen, which is like losing your job or even just walking into a room with somebody who's unpredictable. Internal authority is generated, it's grounded in truth, and there's a lot of self trust that happens, and it really remains this kind of even line no matter the circumstances around you. And I want to make sure that I clarify here, this does not mean that you're emotionally flat. It doesn't mean that you are somebody who speaks really quiet and very slow. I'm from upstate New York. I talk really fast. I've also been told that I talk very loud and that I must have been raised with chainsaws and dragons. But truth is I used to have a hearing problem as a kid, and I definitely speak louder. But I don't default to the mechanism of when I was younger, when I was told that I have to use my indoor voice, which to me felt like I was always whispering and I couldn't hear anything. So the sovereign shift is knowing where you're at. So if we look at the default habit or our old roles versus sovereignty, the hero transforms into the commander. They sit on top of a hill and they kind of survey instead of like launching first thing into the crowd saying, I can do it. The navigator becomes the auditor. They are more discerning of what the truth is instead of trying to smooth everything over like a threat. The copycat turns into the maverick, and it shows up authentically instead of having to like fit in with everybody around them. The mime turns into the agent, and it takes up space without apologizing or shrinking. The martyr knight, it becomes the iron guardian. They recognize they can be strong, but they're better to be part of a force, and they don't have to carry everything alone. And lastly, the candidate becomes a pilot. And so if you think about the pilot, they are the same person regardless of the room or the audience. So I'd like to take this moment and just talk about like authenticity begins with a decision. And it's the conscious belief that I will not abandon myself to maintain belonging. And sovereignty begins with the addition that my voice and values and truth are non negotiable. And these two are the pillars that help bring everything all together. If you'd like to continue this journey, I actually have a companion workbook, and it's called Reclaiming Your Voice and Values in Self Leadership. And it's a workbook for authentic living. It's 41 pages, and it goes through all the information that is in this deck, along with more in-depth look at all the different default modes and then the sovereign companions. You get journal prompts and reflective exercises, and it really helps you to take a look at your life and how you're bringing in authenticity and sovereignty in easy to digestible parts that make it easy to understand. And so there's a webinar discount to thank you for joining this, and you can use the code authentic11 for $11 off the workbook. This is good for 24 hours, and it will expire tomorrow at 1 p.m. And so I want to thank you in advance if you decide to do that. I also have physical copy of the book. This one is for the PDF. There's also a physical copy if you choose to do so. There's some upcoming webinars. So the Thrive Tuesdays happen from 12:30 to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And these are mostly weekly sessions to help you stay grounded and aligned. And so December 2nd, we've been going over signs of burnout. December 9th, trusting intuition. December 16th is the 2026 Wealth Map. And then in January, we'll re-pick up our series with the Sovereign Side Hustle. January 13th is Energetic Boundaries. And then lastly, in January 20th is From Overwhelmed to Action. And then we'll begin our next series after that. I want to thank everybody for attending. And if you need to get a hold of me, my email is on the screen, as well as the website and also my phone. So I'm excited for your next step in your journey, no matter where it takes you. And as always, follow your inner compass.